I didn't just give her my heart. I gave her the keys to my empire. But in the underground, a queen is just a bigger target. Zuri didn't flinch when the rival clans refused to bow to her. She only smiled when Min-jae stepped out of the shadows, shirtless and scarred, showing the world that his dragon now only breathed fire for her. But a secret from Zuri's past in Uganda is about to collide with Min-jae's blood-soaked present. When the dragon discovers who his wife really is, will he protect her? Or will he be the one to end her? Welcome back to part 2, besties. The comments on part 1 were insane. You guys really love the chemistry between Min-jae and Zuri. A huge shout out to everyone who predicted that Zuri was more than just a caregiver. If you thought the first night was intense, wait until you see what happens in chapter 12. Grab your tea, drop a Team Zuri in the comments, and let's get into the continuation of the dragon's reign. The golden light of a soul sunrise bled through the sheer curtains of the master suite, painting the room in hues of honey and amber. Zuri stirred against the silk pillows, her mind momentarily caught between the echoes of her life in Kampala and the heavy reality of the man beside her. She didn't have to look to know he was awake. The air in the room was thick with his presence, a powerful grounding energy that had shifted from predatory to protective overnight. Min-jae was standing by the window, already dressed in a crisp black shirt, though he had left the top buttons undone, revealing the edge of the dragon's tail coiled around his collarbone. When he heard her move, he didn't just offer a cold nod of acknowledgement. He turned, his sharp jaw softening as his intense eyes locked onto hers. "The world looks different this morning," he said, his deep baritone pulling Zuri from the bed. She stood, wrapped in a robe of fine Korean silk, her long braids cascading over her shoulders like a crown. She no longer felt like a caregiver hiding behind a medical bag. She felt the weight of the empire he had placed at her feet. As they walked together toward the dining hall, the atmosphere of the estate had fundamentally changed. The guards, men who had previously looked through Zuri as if she were part of the furniture, suddenly snapped to attention. Their eyes widened as they saw Min-jae stop to adjust the collar of Zuri's robe, his touch lingering with a public display of calculated affection that sent a shockwave through the household. When they reached the heavy oak doors of the breakfast room, a junior guard stepped forward to block Zuri's path, instinctively waiting for Min-jae to enter first as was the custom. Min-jae stopped. The air turned to ice in a second. He didn't raise his voice, but the steel-gray fire in his eyes made the guard tremble. "Step back," Min-jae commanded, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "From this moment on, you do not look at her as a guest or a worker. You look at her as you look at me. Her word is my law. If she speaks, the dragon has spoken." The guard bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the marble floor. Zuri felt a surge of adrenaline, her soft features hardening with a newfound authority. She walked through the door first, her head held high, sensing the shift in the underground circles already beginning. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was the architect of a new order. For 10 years, Min-jae had ruled alone in the cold. This morning, as he pulled out her chair and sat beside her, the decade of dissatisfaction was officially buried under the foundation of their shared throne. The calm of the morning was shattered when a courier, dressed in the sterile gray of a neutral delivery service, left a single crimson envelope at the primary security checkpoint. By the time it reached the breakfast table, the air in the room had turned brittle. Min-jae didn't rush to open it. He sat with a terrifying stillness, his intense eyes fixed on the red paper as if he could incinerate it with a glance. The dragon on his neck seemed to darken, its ink sharp against his pale skin, as he finally slid a silver letter opener through the seal. Zuri watched his sharp jawline tighten until the bone looked ready to snap. Without a word, he tossed the card onto the table. It was embossed with the crest of the Kim Syndicate, his most ruthless rivals. The message was written in an elegant, mocking script. "The Dragon of Soul has traded his fire for a nursemaid. We heard the old man finally found someone to tuck him in at night. Be careful, Min-jae. When a king softens his heart for an outsider, he invites a blade between his ribs." We'll be coming to see if the caregiver knows how to stitch a throat shut. The insult was calculated, designed to strike at Min-jae's pride and Zuri's status as an African woman in his guarded world. Zuri felt a cold shiver trace her spine, but she didn't look away. She reached out, her dark fingers covering the mocking words. "They think I am your weakness," she whispered, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. Min-jae stood abruptly, the heavy chair screeching against the marble floor like a wounded animal. He didn't look at the letter. He looked at her, his expression a storm of inner conflict and raw, possessive fury. "They think because I chose peace for one night, I have forgotten how to wage war," he rasped, his deep voice vibrating with a lethal promise. He leaned over the table, his muscular frame looming over her, not to intimidate but to shield. "They call you an outsider because they are terrified of the power you have over me," he continued, his thumb tracing the line of her braids. "But they made a fatal mistake. They think you are my vulnerability, when in reality, you are the only thing left in this world worth killing for." He turned to his lead guard, his steel-gray eyes turning into flint. "Double the perimeter. If a single soul from the Kim syndicate breathes the same air as this estate, eliminate them. The time for satisfaction is over. Now we remind them why the dragon rules alone." As he walked out to gather his captains, Zuri realized the red envelope wasn't just a threat. It was the opening bell for a war that would test if her healing hands could survive a world of blood. The private training room was a sanctuary of cold steel and padded mats, tucked away in the deepest bowels of the estate where the hum of the city couldn't reach. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the lingering heat of Min-jae's morning workout. He stood in the center of the room, shirtless once more, the dragon on his back appearing to breathe as his muscles flexed in the dim light. Zuri stood opposite him, dressed in simple black leggings and a fitted tank top, her long braids tied back securely. The red envelope from the morning sat like a ghost in the back of her mind, a reminder that her soft, healing hands were no longer enough to survive this world. "In the underground, a second of hesitation is a death sentence," Min-jae said, his deep voice echoing off the walls. He didn't look like a husband or a lover. He looked like the high-ranking underworld figure the world feared. "If someone grabs you, you don't scream for me. You make them regret they ever touched you." He moved toward her, his predatory grace on full display. He reached out, grabbing her wrists with a grip that was firm but controlled. "Break the hold, Zuri. Use your weight." Zuri struggled, her dark skin flushed with the effort, but Min-jae was a wall of iron. Every time she tried to twist away, he adjusted his stance, his intense eyes tracking her every move with a calculated discipline. The physical proximity was intoxicating. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, the scent of sandalwood and sweat filling her senses. As he pulled her back against him to demonstrate a choke release, his shirtless torso pressed firmly against her spine. The air in the room suddenly turned electric. Zuri stopped struggling, her breath catching in her throat as she felt the steady, heavy thrum of his heart through his ribcage. Min-jae's hands lingered on her arms, his thumbs tracing the soft skin of her inner wrists. The lessons in lethality were forgotten as the truth of their attraction boiled over. He turned her around slowly, his sharp jawline inches from her face, his gaze dropping to her lips with a hunger that 10 years of numbness couldn't suppress. "You are a fast learner," he rasped, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. He wasn't looking at her as a student anymore. He was looking at his equal, the woman who had melted his icy exterior and claimed his soul. Zuri reached up, her trembling fingers tracing the warrior motifs on his neck. "I'm not afraid of the danger, Min-jae. I'm only afraid of the silence." The tension snapped like a dry branch. Min-jae crashed his lips against hers, a kiss that tasted of fire and desperate need, sealing their alliance in the sweat and shadows of the training room. The caregiver and the dragon were no longer just a pair. They were a weapon. The Grand Hyatt Soul was a fortress of glass and gold, swarming with the elite of the underworld, a literal gala of wolves. As the heavy doors swung open, the chatter of 100 dangerous men and their diamond-clad wives died into a suffocating silence. Min-jae led the way, looking every bit the high-ranking crime lord in a tailored charcoal suit that emphasized his powerful frame. But tonight, he wasn't the center of attention. All eyes were on the woman on his arm. Zuri was a vision of soft elegance, draped in a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her dark skin and the intricate braids swept high off her neck. She felt the weight of their intense eyes, the judgment of a society that viewed her as an outsider, a mere caregiver who had somehow snared a king. She felt Min-jae's arm tighten beneath her hand, a silent anchor of possessive protection. "Stay close," he whispered, his deep baritone barely audible over the sudden rush of whispers. "The wolves are hungry tonight." They were intercepted halfway across the ballroom by Madame Kim, the sharp-featured wife of Min-jae's greatest rival. She wore a smirk that was as cold as the ice around her neck. "So, this is the little nurse we've heard so much about," Madame Kim said, her voice dripping with calculated condescension. "Tell me, dear, do you find the transition from cleaning bedsores to drinking vintage Cristal overwhelming? I imagine the slums of Kampala didn't prepare you for a seat at this table." The circle of onlookers leaned in, waiting for Zuri to shrink, to stutter, to prove she didn't belong. Min-jae's sharp jaw set, his hand moving toward the edge of his jacket, but Zuri stepped forward before he could intervene. She didn't raise her voice. She let her grace do the work. "Madam Kim, elegance is not something one buys. It is something one is born with," Zuri replied, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to the woman's venom. She tilted her head, her expression one of tender pity. "And as for the table, I noticed your husband recently offloaded his shares in the Busan shipping docks to cover a gambling debt. If you're worried about who belongs at this table, perhaps you should check if your own seat is still paid for." The silence that followed was deafening. Madame Kim's face turned a pale, sickly shade of white. Zuri had used the intel she'd overheard in Min-jae's study, the underground business secrets no one thought she was capable of understanding, to strike a lethal blow. Min-jae's steel-gray eyes sparked with a sudden, fierce pride. He realized then that Zuri wasn't just a healer. She was a tactical genius who could bleed his enemies dry without ever touching a blade. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear in a rare public display of affection. "You didn't just survive the wolves, my queen. You led them to the slaughter." The victory at the gala had tasted like honey, but by the following evening, the air in the park estate had curdled into something bitter and cold. Zuri was in the conservatory, the moonlight filtering through the glass to illuminate the lush African ferns she had requested to remind her of home. She was reaching to prune a leaf when a shadow detached itself from the stone pillar behind her. It wasn't the heavy, disciplined step of Min-jae's guards, nor was it the predatory grace of the dragon himself. It was a rhythmic, uneven gait she recognized from the darkest nightmares of her youth. "You always did have a taste for the finer things, Zuri," a voice rasped from the gloom. Zuri froze, the shears slipping from her hand and clattering onto the marble floor. She turned slowly, her breath hitching in her throat as she faced a man she hadn't seen since the night she fled Kampala. He was tall, scarred, and wore a jagged smirk that spoke of the slums and the blood-soaked debts she thought she had left 18,000 miles behind. "Malik," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How did you find me?" The dragon's new queen is hard to miss, especially when her face is plastered across every society rag and soul, he said, stepping into the light. He looked at the emerald silk of her dress with a look of pure greed. "Your husband thinks he bought a humble caregiver. He thinks you're a victim of circumstance. I wonder, what would he pay to know the real reason you had to disappear? Does he know about the fire? Does he know whose blood is really on those healing hands of yours?" Zuri's soft features paled, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The shadows of Kampala had finally stretched across the ocean to find her. If Min-jae, a man who valued loyalty above life itself, discovered that her arrival in his world wasn't an accident of fate but a calculated flight from a crime, the gilded cage would become a scaffold. I paid my debt, Zuri hissed, her eyes darting toward the security cameras. You haven't even paid the interest, Malik countered, leaning in until she could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. The Kim syndicate is looking for a way to break Min Jae. I think a story about his pure African bride being a fugitive would do the trick. Unless, of course, you make it worth my while to stay silent. Before she could respond, the heavy doors of the conservatory swung open. Min Jae stood there, his intense eyes narrowing as he took in the stranger standing so close to his wife. The dragon on his neck seemed to pulse in the dim light, and the emotionally guarded mask he wore was replaced by a look of lethal suspicion. The truth was cracking open, and Zuri realized that the secrets she had buried in Africa were about to start a war that even the dragon might not be able to win. The air in the conservatory died the moment Min Jae stepped fully into the light. The predatory grace that usually defined his movements had sharpened into something jagged and lethal. He didn't look at Malik. His intense eyes were anchored on Zuri, searching her face for a guilt she couldn't hide. The warmth that had begun to thaw his 10-year winter vanished, replaced by the calculated coldness of the Mafia boss who had earned his throne through blood and distrust. I don't recall inviting guests to my private sanctuary, Min Jae said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the glass panes of the conservatory rattle. Malik, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, took a step back, but his smirk remained. Just an old friend, Mr. Park. Zuri and I go way back. To a night in Kampala she probably hasn't told you about yet. Min Jae's sharp jawline tightened. He didn't ask for an explanation. He simply gestured to the shadows, and 2 guards appeared instantly, dragging Malik out of the room. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the confrontation. Min Jae walked toward Zuri, his muscular frame looming over her, the dragon on his neck appearing to writhe in the dim moonlight. He stopped inches away, but the emotional warmth she had worked so hard to cultivate was gone. He looked at her as he looked at a business rival, as a puzzle to be solved and a threat to be neutralized. You told me you were a caregiver, he rasped, his voice dropping to a gravelly tone that sent a chill through her soul. You told me you were a victim of your father's debts. But a simple worker doesn't have ghosts from the slums of Africa following her to Seoul. Min Jae, I can explain, Zuri whispered, her dark fingers reaching out to touch his arm, but he flinched away. The rejection felt like a physical blow. Did you seek me out? He questioned, his steel-gray eyes narrowing with a sudden piercing jealousy. Was the tender expression and the healing touch just a tactical move to find a protector powerful enough to hide a fugitive? For 10 years I was satisfied with my solitude because I knew exactly who my enemies were. Now I look at you and I don't know if I'm holding a queen or a Trojan horse. He turned his back to her, his posture rigid and emotionally guarded. The dragon's jealousy wasn't born from a lack of love, but from the terrifying realization that he had made himself vulnerable to a woman who might be a lie. Until I know who you really are, Zuri, the gates are locked. You aren't my equal tonight. You are a prisoner in a gilded cage once more. As he walked out, leaving her alone among the ferns, Zuri realized that her secrets hadn't just brought a threat to his door, they had frozen the heart she had spent weeks trying to melt. The following 48 hours were a blur of icy silence and agonizing distance. Min Jae had retreated into his command center, his emotionally guarded mask more impenetrable than ever, leaving Zuri to wander the high-security halls of the estate like a ghost. But the Cold War between them was violently interrupted when a burner phone, left anonymously at the front gate, vibrated with a video message that made the blood drain from Zuri's face. The screen flickered to life, showing a dusty, dimly lit room in Kampala. In the center was a young boy, tied to a wooden chair, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored Zuri's own. It was her younger brother, Kofi. A man stood behind him, his face obscured by the shadows, but the heavy gold ring on his finger bore the distinct mark of the Kim syndicate. The dragon has a new horde, a distorted voice hissed through the speaker. But he forgot that some treasures have roots. If Min Jae doesn't surrender the Busan shipping routes by midnight, the boy dies. A debt in blood, Zuri. Tell your king his pride isn't worth a child's life. Zuri burst into Min-jae's study, the phone clutched in her shaking hand. She didn't wait for the guards to announce her. She threw the device onto his mahogany desk, her voice a fractured plea. They have Kofi. Min-jae, please. They have my brother. Min-jae stood slowly, his intense eyes scanning the video with a calculated lethality. The dragon on his neck seemed to pulse with a dark, rhythmic anger. He looked at the boy, then at Zuri's tear-streaked face. For a moment, the suspicion and jealousy that had clouded his judgment vanished, replaced by the primal possessive instinct of a predator whose territory had been breached. They went to Uganda, he whispered, his deep baritone dropping to a terrifying register. They bypassed my security and went for the one thing they knew would break you. He walked around the desk, his muscular frame looming over her. He didn't offer a hug. He offered a promise. He placed a heavy, grounding hand on her shoulder, his steel-gray eyes locking onto hers. They think they have forced me into a corner. They think I will trade my empire for a life I didn't know existed until 10 minutes ago. Will you? Zuri gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Min-jae leaned in, his sharp jaw set in a line of grim discipline. No, I won't trade a single cent. Because by the time the sun rises in Kampala, there won't be a member of the Kim syndicate left alive to hold a blade. They wanted to see the monster, Zuri. Now I'm going to show them why the world fears the fire. While Min-jae gathered his generals to plan a scorched earth invasion, he made the mistake of assuming Zuri would wait in the shadows of the penthouse, praying for a miracle. He didn't realize that a woman who had survived the streets of Kampala and the cold scrutiny of Seoul had already learned that waiting was just a slow way to die. As soon as the heavy doors of the war room clicked shut, Zuri moved with a calculated speed that would have made the dragon himself pause. She didn't go to her bedroom to weep. She went to the communications hub in the basement. The technicians looked up in shock, their hands hovering over their keyboards as the lady of the house swept into the room. Her emerald silk dress replaced by a tactical black jumpsuit that emphasized her lean, graceful strength. Open a secure line to the Kampala Port Authority, she commanded, her voice carrying a melodic authority that brooked no argument. And get me the encryption keys for the Kim Syndicate's private ledger. Ma'am, Mr. Park hasn't authorized. The lead analyst began, but Zuri cut him off with a look that was as intense and steel-gray as Min-jae's. I am not asking for authorization. I am telling you to save the life of a child, she hissed, leaning over his shoulder. Min-jae is preparing for a war of blood. I am preparing for a war of shadows. If you want to keep your heads when this is over, you will follow my lead. Under the cover of Min-jae's loud, distracting troop movements, Zuri launched a surgical counterstrike. She didn't use guns. She used the very underground business intel she had gathered while cleaning wounds and attending galas. She leaked the location of the Kim Syndicate's offshore accounts to a rival faction in Tokyo, creating a chaotic civil war within their own ranks. Simultaneously, she utilized the Park family's private satellite to track the burner phone signal back to a specific warehouse on the outskirts of Kampala. By the time Min-jae emerged from his war room, ready to board his private jet, his phone buzzed with a notification that drained the color from his face. The Kim Syndicate stock had plummeted. Their African safe house was being raided by local authorities he hadn't even contacted, and a video file sat in his inbox. Kofi, safe and being escorted to a secure location by Zuri's own contacts. Min-jae stood in the foyer, his muscular frame rigid with shock as Zuri walked down the grand staircase to meet him. She looked like an untouchable queen, her soft features set in a mask of lethal triumph. She had used his own empire to outmaneuver the wolves before he could even draw his sword. The dragon of Seoul looked at his wife and felt a new kind of terror, the realization that he hadn't just married a caregiver. He had married a woman who could conquer the world while he was still putting on his boots. The adrenaline of the counterstrike had faded, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. They were back in the master suite, the city lights of Seoul blinking like distant embers beyond the glass. Min-jae sat on the edge of the bed, his head bowed, the weight of his black shirt discarded on the floor. In the dim, amber glow of the bedside lamp, the dragon on his back looked more like a scar than a masterpiece. Zuri approached him softly, her movements devoid of the sharp, tactical edge she had displayed hours ago. She was once again the healer, but this time the wound she sought was invisible. She knelt behind him, her dark fingers tracing the scales of the dragon that wound around his spine. "You've lived behind this ink for a long time," she whispered. Min-jae's shoulders tensed, a low shudder rippling through his muscular frame. "In this world we mark ourselves so the demons recognize their own," he rasped, his voice thick with a decade of suppressed pain. He turned slightly, his intense eyes glassy. "The dragon wasn't a choice, Zuri. It was a brand. 10 years ago, when my father was executed by the men he trusted, they forced me to watch. Then they sat me in a chair for 30 hours, tattooing this beast onto my skin while I was still covered in his blood. They told me it was my inheritance, a map of every life I would have to take to survive." Zuri's breath hitched. She finally understood the inner conflict that had defined him. The dragon wasn't a symbol of his power, but a constant reminder of his trauma. He had been physically unsatisfied and emotionally hollow because every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the face of the men who had broken him. He wasn't the monster. He was the boy who had survived one. "You are not the ink, Min-jae," Zuri said firmly, her tender expression grounding him. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the center of the dragon's head on his back, her heat seeping into his chilled skin. "They gave you the mark, but they couldn't take the man. You saved me, you protected my brother, and you chose to love a woman who was a stranger. That is not the work of a beast." As she held him, the steel-gray hardness in Min-jae's eyes finally shattered. He turned into her embrace, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his large hands gripping her waist as if she were the only thing keeping him from drifting away. For the first time in 10 years, the dragon of soul wept, silent, racking sobs that cleansed the air of a decade's worth of ice. In the quiet of the night, Zuri didn't just mend a surface wound. She healed the spirit of a king, proving that the greatest power in his empire wasn't fear, but the grace of the woman who saw past the ink. The fragile peace of their shared vulnerability was shattered by a sound that didn't belong to the night, the synchronized metallic thud of breaching charges at the perimeter. The floor beneath them shuddered, and the lights of the penthouse flickered before dying, plunging the suite into a cold, clinical darkness. Min-jae was on his feet in a heartbeat, his predatory grace returning with a ferocity that made the air turn sharp. "The Kims," he rasped, the steel gray of his eyes catching the moonlight as he reached beneath the bed for a hidden cache. "They aren't looking for a parley anymore. This is an extermination." He didn't try to hide Zuri in a closet or tell her to stay behind. He handed her a sleek, matte black handgun, his large hand covering hers for a brief, grounding second. The inner conflict was gone, replaced by a lethal clarity. They were no longer patient and caregiver. They were two halves of a single warring soul. "Remember what I taught you in the training room. Aim for the center, and don't stop until they're down." The sound of shattering glass erupted from the grand foyer as black-clad figures rappelled through the skylight. Min-jae moved like a shadow, his muscular frame a blur of motion as he intercepted the first wave. He fought with a disciplined violence, his movements echoing the dragon on his back, fluid, powerful and final. Beside him, Zuri was a revelation. She didn't scream. She used the architecture of the house as a shield, her tactical genius, guiding her as she flanked a group of attackers trying to pin Min-jae down. The soul siege turned the marble hallways into a corridor of fire. Zuri felt the heat of a bullet graze her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. She saw the man who fired, and with a steady breath, she pulled the trigger, neutralizing the threat with the same precision she used to stitch a wound. Min-jae roared, a primal sound of possessive rage, as he cleared the remaining invaders from the landing. He moved to her side, his body acting as a shield, his blood mixing with hers where their shoulders touched. They fought back to back, a dark-skinned queen and her scarred king, holding the line against a tide of wolves. In the chaos of the gunfire and the smoke, the world saw the truth of the Park Empire. It wasn't just built on fear. It was now anchored by a love that was ready to burn the city to the ground. As the last of the intruders fell and the sirens began to wail in the distance, Min-jae looked at Zuri. Her face smeared with soot but her eyes glowing with a fierce, regal fire. They had survived the night, but the war had just become personal. The acrid scent of gunpowder still clung to the silk wallpaper as the emergency lights hummed with a sickly red glow. The siege had been broken, but the silence that followed was more unsettling than the gunfire. Min-jae stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his knuckles split and bleeding. He wasn't looking at the bodies of the invaders. His gaze was fixed on the security monitors that lined the wall of his private study. Something was wrong. The breach had been too perfect, the timing too precise. "They didn't break in, Zuri," Min-jae whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "They were let in." Zuri, her tactical suit torn at the shoulder, watched as Min-jae's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the internal logs. Beside her, the lead guards stood in a rigid line, their faces masks of stone. Among them was Sang-ho, the man who had served Min-jae for 7 years, a soldier who had bled for the Park family long before Zuri ever stepped off a plane from Uganda. Min-jae paused the footage. On the screen, a grainier angle showed a side entrance being deactivated minutes before the attack. The silhouette of the man at the keypad was unmistakable. Min-jae turned slowly, his steel-gray eyes locking onto Sang-ho with a lethality that made the other guards instinctively move away. 7 years, Sang-ho, Min-jae said, his sharp jawline pulsing. "I treated you like a brother." "Why?" Sang-ho didn't beg for mercy. Instead, his face contorted with a bitter, simmering resentment. "You weren't a brother. You were a king until she arrived," he spat, gesturing toward Zuri. "We built this empire on blood and tradition. Then you brought an outsider, a nurse, into our inner sanctum. You gave her the keys to the vaults and a seat at the table while we stayed in the shadows. You traded our loyalty for a tender expression from a woman who doesn't even know our language." The inner conflict flashed briefly in Min-jae's eyes before hardening into ice. The traitor within wasn't motivated by money, but by the same narrow-minded hate that Zuri had faced at the gala. Sang-ho saw her as a weakness, a blemish on the dragon's reputation. Zuri stepped forward, her soft features hardening into a mask of regal authority. She didn't look at Sang-ho with anger, but with a cold, calculated pity. "You didn't betray him because of me," she said, her voice steady and melodic. "You betrayed him because you were too small to realize that a king is only as strong as the heart he protects. You wanted the dragon to stay cold so you could feel warm. Now you'll find out just how cold it gets without him." Min-jae didn't hesitate. With a flick of his wrist, he signaled the other guards. As Sang-ho was dragged away into the darkness, Min-jae pulled Zuri into his side, his large hand gripping her waist with a fierce, possessive need. The betrayal had cut deep, but it had only served to weld them closer together. The house was purged, but the shadows were growing longer. The smoke from the siege had settled into a heavy mist that clung to the shattered windows, but the air inside the suite was thinner than ever. Min-jae sat in a velvet armchair, the shadows deepening the hollows of his cheeks and the sharp jawline that seemed carved from granite. He was cleaning a deep cut on his forearm, his movements mechanical, his steel-gray eyes fixed on nothing. The betrayal by Sang-ho had ripped open old wounds of distrust, and now the silence between him and Zuri felt like a precipice. "He said I didn't know the real reason you fled Africa," Min-jae said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the quiet. He didn't look up. "He said you had blood on your hands. If we are to survive the Kims, I cannot have a ghost standing behind me, Zuri." "Who are you?" Zuri stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the flickering neon of the city. She took a slow, grounding breath, the night of no secrets finally arriving. "I wasn't just a caregiver in Kampala, Min-jae," she began, her voice steady but laced with a raw, ancient sorrow. My father was a doctor, but he was also a man who stood against the local warlords. When they came for him, I didn't just watch. I led them into a trap. I burned their storehouse with them inside to give my brother a chance to run. She turned to face him, her tender expression replaced by the cold steel of a survivor. I am a fugitive not because I am a victim, but because I am a soldier who did what was necessary. I didn't come to Seoul to find a protector. I came to disappear. But then I found a man who was as haunted as I was. The tension peaked, vibrating in the small space between them. Min-jae stood, his muscular frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over her. He walked toward her slowly, his intense eyes unreadable. This was the moment of the great divide. He could exile her for her deception, or he could accept that their souls were forged in the same fire. He stopped inches away, his hand reaching out. Zuri braced herself for a push, for the cold command to leave his sight forever. Instead, his thumb brushed the soot from her cheek, his touch lingering with a desperate, primal, possessive heat. You didn't lead them into a trap to survive, he rasped, his voice breaking the decade-long ice once and for all. You did it to protect what was yours. We're the same, Zuri. You aren't my weakness. You are my mirror. He pulled her into a crushing embrace, burying his face in her hair. The decision was made. He wouldn't exile his queen, he would arm her. The following night, the air in Seoul didn't just feel cold, it felt hollow. Min-jae had left the estate before the moon reached its peak, refusing the escort of his personal guard. This wasn't a tactical maneuver for the Park Empire. This was the dragon's vengeance. The Kim syndicate had breached his home, threatened his blood, and laid hands on the woman who had brought light back to his dead eyes. For that, there would be no negotiation, only an ending. He moved through the Kim syndicate's waterfront warehouse like a literal ghost. His predatory grace evolved into something far more demonic. In the dim, flickering light of the industrial space, Min-jae didn't use a silencer. He used the environment, his muscular frame, weaving through the shadows with a lethal efficiency that left the guards gasping for air they would never breathe again. He was a blur of black silk and flashing steel, his intense eyes burning with a cold, focused fire. When he reached the inner sanctum where the Kim elders sat, the doors didn't creak, they exploded inward. Min-jae stepped through the smoke, shirtless, the dragon on his back slick with the sweat of the hunt and the dark spray of his enemies. He looked like a creature of myth, a warrior king who had crawled out of hell to claim a debt. The steel gray of his gaze was so terrifying that the men who had mocked him for softening dropped their weapons, paralyzed by a primal fear. You called her an outsider, Min-jae rasped, his voice a low, guttural snarl that echoed off the high ceilings. He moved toward the head of the table, his sharp jawline set in a mask of absolute ruin. You thought my heart was a weakness, but you forgot that a dragon only burns the world when its treasure is touched. He didn't kill them quickly. He dismantled their power brick by brick, forcing them to watch as he deleted their accounts and scorched their legacies on his tablet with a single finger. When the physical violence finally came, it was calculated and absolute. He showed his most terrifying side yet, not the boss who delegates, but the monster who enjoys the weight of justice in his own hands. By the time he stepped back out into the night air, the Kim syndicate was a memory, and the dragon of Seoul was drenched in the cost of his love. He had destroyed an entire empire in a single night, proving that for Zuri, he would not only rule the world, he would burn it to ash. While Min-jae was a storm of fire and steel at the waterfront, the heart of the Park Empire sat in a cold, glass-walled boardroom on the 55th floor. The atmosphere was thick with a different kind of danger. The remaining captains, men with graying hair and hearts made of flint, sat around the mahogany table, their whispers growing louder as the minutes ticked by without their leader. They were restless, smelling a power vacuum, and many looked toward the empty head of the table with predatory hunger. The double doors swung open, and the whispers died instantly. Zuri walked in, her stride echoing with a confidence that felt like a gavel striking stone. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal wool, her long braids swept back into a sharp regal crown. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight to the head of the table and sat in Min-jae's chair, her dark skin luminous against the black leather. "He is in the field," she said, her voice a smooth, melodic command that cut through the tension. "And while he handles the blood, I am here to handle the business. Does anyone have an objection?" A senior advisor, a man who had survived 3 transitions of power, leaned forward with a mocking smile. "With all due respect, Lady Zuri, this isn't a hospital wing. This is an empire. These men expect a commander who understands the logistics of the black market, not someone who specializes in comfort." Zuri didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her soft features hardening into a mask of calculated brilliance. She opened a tablet and began scrolling through a series of encrypted files she had redirected during her earlier counterstrike. "Let's talk about logistics then, Mr. Choi. I've already rerouted the Busan shipments through a neutral port in Mombasa to avoid the Kim syndicate's remaining loyalists. I've also frozen the accounts of the 3 subsidiaries currently trying to siphon funds while the boss is distracted. And as for your private offshore account in the Cayman Islands, the one you haven't declared to the family, I've placed a digital lock on it that only I can release." The room went ice cold. Mr. Choi's face turned a ghostly shade of gray as he looked around at his peers, seeing the shift in their eyes. They weren't looking at a nursemaid anymore. They were looking at an African empress who had mastered their game while they were busy underestimating her. "Min-jae is the dragon," Zuri continued, her voice dropping to a low, elegant vibration. "But a dragon needs a mind to guide its fire. If you want to survive the night, you will follow my directives. If you want to challenge me, the door is behind you, but I promise you won't make it to the lobby." By the time the meeting ended, every man in the room had bowed. Zuri sat alone for a moment, her heart racing beneath her composed exterior. She had proven she could handle the underground business circles, with the same grace she used to save a life. She was no longer just the woman Min-jae loved. She was the architect of his survival. The sun rose over Seoul not as a herald of another cold day of war, but as a witness to a new era. The glass walls of the Park estate were still being repaired, yet the atmosphere inside was transformed. The scent of gunpowder and betrayal had been replaced by the rich, earthy aroma of African coffee and the subtle sweetness of Korean plum blossom. Min-jae stood on the balcony, his muscular frame finally relaxed, his sharp jawline no longer set in a permanent grimace of pain. The dragon on his back, once a brand of trauma, now looked like a guardian resting in the light. He heard the soft click of Zuri's heels against the marble. She joined him at the railing, her presence a warm, grounding force. Together they looked out over the city they had conquered, not just through fear, but through an alliance of blood, intellect, and an unbreakable bond. The Park Adebayo alliance was the talk of the underground, a union of 2 continents and 2 souls that had proven to be untouchable. Kofi was safe in the guest wing, the Kim syndicate was a pile of ash, and the boardroom was finally silent, cowed by the African empress who had outplayed them all. Min-jae turned to her, his intense eyes reflecting a peace that had eluded him for 10 long years. For a decade, he had moved through the world as a ghost, physically unsatisfied and emotionally hollow, believing that satisfaction was a commodity he could buy with power. He realized now that he had been wrong. "For 10 years I thought I was waiting for a war to end," Min-jae rasped, his deep voice filled with a raw, authentic warmth. He reached out, his large hand cupping Zuri's face, his thumb tracing her tender expression with a reverence that made the world fall away. "I didn't realize I was just waiting for you to show me that I was worth saving." Zuri leaned into his touch, her dark skin a beautiful contrast to his pale, scarred hand. "I didn't come here to be your caregiver, Min-jae," she whispered, a playful yet profound smile touching her lips. "I think I came here to find the other half of my own strength." Min-jae pulled her flush against his chest, his heart beating a steady, satisfied rhythm against hers. The eternal satisfaction he had found wasn't in the total victory over his enemies or the expansion of his empire. It was in the quiet realization that Zuri wasn't a girl who had stumbled into his life. She was his destiny. The dragon and the healer had become one, a singular force that would rule the night with fire and the morning with grace. The winter was truly over. For the first time in his life, the dragon of soul was finally home.